I don't play D&D, and honestly, I'm not all that big a fan of high fantasy in general. But I do like podcasts. They're a great way to liven up hours spent in an Excel spreadsheet at the office or add some pizzazz to a commute home. And though I subscribe to a few dozen podcasts, there are actually very few that I follow religiously. The Adventure Zone, a high fantasy podcast that began as an extended game of D&D and has since morphed into something else, is one of them. It is yet another creation from the McElroy family, whose like 60 other podcasts I have given tries but never really been able to commit to. Though I'm really glad that Monster Factory still exists because it is genuinely one of my favorite things on YouTube. Every podcast reminds me of something, be it a place, time, or even action. The Doughboys makes me think of Thursday morning push-ups, since that's what I'm always doing when I start listening. Why'd You Push That Button makes me think about work, since that's typically where I start that. The Adventure Zone, on the other hand, reminds me of Japan, and Kyoto in particular. 2 and change years ago, during the Passover holiday, I took a trip to Asia. I went to 3 cities in 2 countries across 8 days, which wasn't the correct way to do things and not at all something that you should do. I traveled alone and spent a lot of time either in transit or just walking around, and it was during that time that I started to listen to the show, which I had seen recommended but had never been able to commit myself to. By the time I got to Japan, though, I was hooked. And as I roamed the streets of Kyoto, soaking in the sights, stopping to take the occasional photo, but mostly just looking around, I did so with the boys in my ears. I loved it. And I will never not hear that theme song without thinking of cherry blossoms. I quickly caught up and became a regular listener, which I remain to this day, even if the current Monster of the Week-based Amnesty storyline, now in its final arc, is not nearly as brilliant as its predecessor. So I was obviously intrigued when they announced that the Balance arc, which is the D&D-based one that started it all, would be getting a graphic novelization. A little apprehensive. What the heck? I figured I'd give it a try. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week I Review. You can call me a guy who occasionally uses the term sequential art. And today, I'm talking about the second graphic novel adaptation of the Adventure Zone Balance, Murder on the Rockport Limited. I didn't love reading There Be Gerblins, the first adaptation following the first arc, but I chalked that up in part to it being based on the least interesting segment of the show. They were still figuring out what they were doing, and it hewed most closely to a pre-written storyline. It wasn't until the Mad Max-inspired third arc, Pedals to the Metal, that they really started pushing boundaries, but Murder on the Rockport Limited delivers a good old-fashioned murder mystery set on a train, and I quite like those. Plus, this was their first time adapting to a new medium, taking another crack at the whole graphic novel thing with both a more interesting storyline and now more experience under their belt. It seems like they might be able to address some of the first book's underlying issues. They did not. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, because it probably isn't possible to recapture the magic of an Adventure Zone record, where Griffin the Dungeon Master has all kinds of plans and the adventurers are here to muck things up live and improvise. The spontaneity is the thing. And spontaneity doesn't translate in retrospect. It can't really. But even if it could, sequential art wouldn't be the way to do it. Graphic novels forcibly compress time in a huge way. It is the most fundamental difference between manga and anime. A chapter of Dragon Ball Z actually moves pretty quickly, but an entire episode of the show could just be dedicated to Goku powering up. On some level, that's fine. The space between panels has to get filled somehow. It can be a little annoying, but I was also a child with far fewer important things to do back when I watched that show, so, whatever. A podcast to graphic novel adaptation is going the other direction, but like really, really far in the other direction. We're going from having only audio to no audio at all, and 7 hours to 218 beautifully drawn pages. Does that sound like a lot of pages? It's not. I had fun seeing beloved characters artistically rendered, and Carrie Peach's art is genuinely great. I didn't really have any preconceived notions of what characters look like. I have basic assumptions like Angus MacDonald is probably Irish, and boy howdy is he not. But beyond that, not much. To be honest, I don't have a great visual imagination. The words in a podcast translate to text in my head, not images. So however they decide it looks, I'm not gonna flip out about it. But that's also part of why it is the thing I care about least. And if that's all a graphic novel has to offer, it's not much. And here we get to the point where you say, hey idiot, you can't compare an adaptation to its source material. It's its own entity and should be judged only on its own merits. And fair enough. So let's do that. I think it's important to note that it's not like a transcript with pictures. There is a genuine attempt at retelling the story in a new medium. Scenes are moved around and old jokes are changed while new ones are created. An objectively dramatic scene towards the end of the arc that has next to no stakes during the podcast plays out very, very differently with a serious attempt at emotion that doesn't really work, but I appreciate the effort. I think the real problem is that it has an identity crisis, and it feels chained to something that it wants, but is unable to escape. I can imagine a version of this graphic novel that keeps the fourth wall entirely intact, where we see the characters play out the narrative without any acknowledgement that there is something more behind the scenes. Would it be any good? Hard to know. Would fans of the series revolt? Probably. Would it result in a more coherent story? Almost definitely. They could have also done the exact opposite thing, making the McElroys themselves the main characters and having the balanced world be definitively imagined. You could do a lot with that version of things, leaning into the improvisational aspect of the production. Heck, make Peach an increasingly frustrated character too. That scene where Griffin forgets Angus's age could have shown the character as both ages as it was being canonized, or the John Woo-esque doves that accompany a SWAT-light room breach could have just turned into flying Dougs because Griffin misspoke. What I really want, though, would be to see depictions of all of the many times Griffin tells them that, oops, I guess you're dead now, in some ridiculous, immediately retracted way. Don't get me wrong, this would be extremely difficult to pull off if it could be pulled off at all, which I'm not convinced that it could, and in any case, it would require a much, much longer book to get through even this simplified amount of story. But it would have been a really interesting use of the medium. What we get is something in between, neither as focused as a pure narrative or as experimental as a true game depiction. It's more the former, complicated largely by the presence of the dungeon master as a character in the book. Griffin's appearances are occasional and brief, and he pops up periodically to remind everyone that this is a game with rules that clearly the players don't know very well. But he's talking to the D&D characters, Taco, Magnus, and Merle, not their human players, Justin, Travis, and Clint. And that creates this bizarre dissonance, as does every time written Taco talks about spell slots or what have you. It is a constant reminder of the source material, but missing why the moments work in the source material. For all the changes, there is a lot that tries to play out the same way, but the jokes don't work when the performance was the entire joke. Take, for example, Train Wizard Jenkins's line about his pleasure chamber not being a sex thing, it's just his voice making everything sound like a sex thing. This is funny, when it's said in Griffin's sultry Jenkins voice, something that changes several times as he tries to figure out a version that won't ruin his throat, itself a part of the joke. But on the page, it doesn't mean anything. The only way you laugh at that is if you remember what Griffin's Jenkins voice sounds like. So you have to already know it to appreciate it. And it's not like an Easter egg in the back of a panel to make capital T, capital F true fans feel good about their time investment. It's the whole joke. And so we get to a big question that really frames everything. Who is this for? Is this for people like me who love the podcast and read every bit of dialogue in the character voices and so get to feel all warm and fuzzy with the memories of our good podcast buddies doing their good podcast thing? It feels like it must be. I have trouble believing that anyone who had not listened to The Adventure Zone would pick up the graphic novelization of The Adventure Zone, and those who did would just be confused by the way Griffin is like shoehorned into things. But it also seems like they, me, are the people who will get the least out of it. I can feel the compromise on every page, and it just makes me sad. I didn't hate it or anything. Indeed, there were a couple of times I audibly guffawed. It just feels like it lacks any reason to exist in the form that it does, like it's a graphic novel out of financial necessity rather than a creative one. I'd bet at least $7 that they would get millions if they blatantly copied Critical Role's idea for a kickstarted animated series, which I expect would be better, even if it wouldn't necessarily address the fundamental issues around the probable impossibility of recapturing spontaneity. But Murder on the Rockport Limited did do something that Here There Be Gerblins didn't. Push me into the backlog itself. I had not gone back to Balance at all since it ended or ever re-listened to any part of it, but I've spent the last few days listening to this story in its original form, and I have been greatly enjoying that time. I'd recommend you do the same, instead of reading it. 4.7 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, that's great. If not, I'm sorry. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. I have to see you next week.